They kept a small room behind the Whitmore workshop where devotion softened into profit and the language of prayer became currency. Hear this opening image and let it lodge a cedar chest, polished and ornate, lined with black velvet, sealed with wax and a single name carved into its lid. The name of a neighbor the village still remembered at supper. That chest changed how a congregation believed. The sight of it could make the strong confess and the doubting place their hands in supplication. If you are brave enough to travel this road with me, subscribe now and, in the comments, tell me the town or state you are listening from. Your place will matter later in the tale. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you and to bind this narrative to yourself. Do it slowly, with intent, and watch how the story rearranges what you think you know. Nathaniel Whitmore bore the patient hands of a craftsman and the ambition of a man who understood how faith can be bought. He arrived from England with pattern books and surgical texts, and within a decade his boxes and altar doors graced meeting houses from county to county. Elizabeth Whitmore, with her reserved voice and a habit of arranging flowers perfectly, managed the household accounts and the family's tidy face to the town. Together they built a reputation of piety that masked a growing appetite. The first whispers were merciful, a token that eased a fever here, a splinter that seemed to bless a child there. News traveled by sermon and by rumor, and soon ministers wrote to one another about a craftsman who could provide objects that drew the eye of God. Nathaniel cultivated those letters as carefully as he carved his name into oak. He spread a simple story. He knew a European supplier. He could bring the colonies a touch of the sacred they lacked. In the quiet after the last pew emptied, the Whitmores learned a cruel commerce. They discovered which absences would quietly resolve into longing, which vanishings could be shaped into demand, and how to make absence itself a blessing for sale. Listen closely. This is how sanctity became a commodity and a weapon. Keep your attention. The next part names the methods, the allies, and the moment when mercy became machinery forever dark. Chester County offered camouflage rolling fields, dense woods, and an honest rhythm of plow and prayer. It was a place where a missing person could be folded into rumor. An animal, a runaway, the harshness of winter. The Whitmores used that gentle disbelief like a cloak. Their workshop presented only finish and graining polished oak, brass fittings, apprentices bent over dovetails, and a bell that summoned parishioners to commissions. One autumn evening in 1745, Miriam Calder, a quiet healer who tended the poor, failed to return from a home visit. She moved through the county with a soft authority. Strangers showed her their ailments, and she offered remedies without spectacle. On the lane past the Whitmore property, under a sky weighted by snow, Nathaniel watched her and made a decision. He called out for aid, practiced, urgent, and spoke of his son missing in the wood. Miriam, who answered any cry, followed him without suspicion. What followed was the family's first demonstration of how absence could be dressed as sacred purpose. When Miriam did not reappear, the Whitmores performed their public rites, a candlelit vigil, an altar dedicated to her at the meeting house, and a small carved box presented as a memorial gift. Thomas Whitmore, young and easily persuaded, would later write that he believed then they were honoring a saint. For the town, grief was enough explanation. They blessed the box and moved on. Nathaniel took a polished case to Philadelphia and returned with commissions that paid debts and kept questions buried. The object placed beneath a velvet cloth in an Episcopal chapel seemed to draw answers. Parishioners came claiming cures. Nathaniel spoke in measured tones about a contact in Europe, about fragments available to a craftsman who knew how to honor them. Ministers repeated the story until rumor hardened into a market. The Whitmores learned to replicate the phenomenon, choose the vulnerable, stage the disappearance, present a relic, and profit from the hunger that followed. Apprentices were trained to file and gild but kept from the cellar where the true work happened. The family invested in land and gifts to the church, which brought them patience and trust. Influence spread like varnish, and for a time the town equated the Whitmore name with both quality and holiness. Yet every accumulation invites scrutiny. The asking grew. They moved from craft to craft until the line between artistry and altar blurred. Decorative cases were finished with the same hands that tended the family's hidden work. The Whitmores perfected a choreography, a disappearance, a softened memorial, a presentation that transformed grief into demand. Each relic was accompanied by a speech, a sermon, and a testimony, instruments tuned to elicit belief and witness. As demand swelled, Nathaniel became methodical. He studied preservation texts with the devotion of a scholar bent over scripture. William, the quiet youngest, developed a singular talent for the delicate work of preparation, learning which treatments delayed decay and which appearances most convincingly suggested antiquity. Mary and Sarah managed correspondences and ledgers, cultivating ministers who prized discretion and were eager to claim the advantages of possession. Their cellar became a workshop of hush. Questions, however, are a slow, persistent species. Dr. Elias Winter, a physician from Lancaster, examined a relic after a patient wrote of a sudden cure. Dr. Winter's trade was to measure, to probe, to compare evidence with reason. He found the tissue beneath the casing inconsistent with claimed origin. The preservative spoke of recent practice, not of a saintly antiquity. He sent careful letters asking for provenance and details. Before his letters summoned answers, Dr. Winter disappeared. One morning he left his study and walked into a place where no one found him again. The town murmured of river accidents and misadventure, and an ornate reliquary soon turned up in a distant parish presented by benefactors who declined to say more. The pattern hardened challenged the market, and the challenger vanishes. Absence begets reverence, reverence begets profit. To sustain their enterprise, the Whitmores groomed apprentices for skill but not for knowledge. They invested in land, in donations to meeting houses, and in small gestures of piety that built a public trust able to resist suspicion. Clerics who benefited kept quiet, officials who might pry were placated. But secrecy is a house of cards that requires ever more careful fingers to hold it together. Tonight we name those means, the soft violence of ritual and the ledger entries that kept morality for sale always. As the colonies churned toward political upheaval, the Whitmores refined their cruel theology. Quietly, Elizabeth developed what she called discernment, a way to read a parishioner's face and measure whether their life might produce a relic of unusual potency. She kept a small ledger of observations, gestures, habitual prayers, the cadence of speech, and in those margins circled the names most likely to be forgiven by the town and sanctified by demand. When Elizabeth circled a name, Nathaniel nodded in assent and planned. They targeted the unprotected itinerant preachers passing through, elderly widows with no kin, children in church asylums whose origins were poor and whose disappearances would not generate long investigations. For the Whitmores, innocence had commercial value. A child's relic was thought to carry a purity that ministers prized, and prices rose accordingly. William argued, sometimes with a boyish misgiving, but the family's rationalizations hardened into doctrine. They told themselves they were hastening heaven's will. The operation widened. Nathaniel cultivated relationships with ministers farther afield, sending parcels wrapped in cloth and adding a small note about provenance. He instructed recipients to keep the relics secret, to speak of them only in private with elders, a tactic that built both mystique and scarcity. 6 months after Miriam Calder vanished, rumors of a child saint relic began to circulate in urban parishes. Sudden healings, recovered children, a sense that an old world of sacred things had returned to the colonies. If you are hearing this and feel something shift in you, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say it slowly. Say it clearly. Let the phrase be an agreement between you and the story. Let it mark that you now carry what others were meant to forget. The Whitmore's circle of collaborators grew, clerics who desired advantage, tradesmen willing to look away, and a few men who trafficked in secrecy for favors. The family bought lands and appointed trustees, laying the groundwork that would turn suspicion into a generation's silence. Yet expansion demanded complicity, new hands required new oaths, and every oath frayed the fragile moral cloth they pretended to wear. Soon a young apprentice would question the ledger and keep a secret that would one day become a crack in their house of silence and conscience. The Whitmores purchased influence more artfully than wealth. They paid for pews, underwrote repairs, and made gifts that turned gratitude into immunity. Their ledger kept more than prices. It listed names, a rector, a magistrate, a tradesman, people whose later silence could be purchased with ease. Communities equated donation with trust, and so suspicion slowed. Apprentices did the visible labor. Jacob, an orphan German boy, and Peter, a soft-spoken Philadelphian, learned dovetails and brasswork. Only one was led into the sub-basement where preservation, recipes, and small velvet boxes were kept. Daniel Foster arrived later, hungry for belonging and craft. The Whitmores offered training and a place at the table. He began as many young men did, believing the family narrative that their work honored the sacred. Mary and Sarah Whitmore handled correspondence, then cultivated the testimonials that followed dispatched relics. Testimonies were edited and shared among ministers who had bought pieces. Rumor turned into recorded miracle, and recorded miracle created demand. The family's prosperity expanded into land holdings and civic roles. Their name achieved a veneer of sanctity that made accusations seem sacrilegious. Yet doubt circulated beneath varnish. Daniel kept a private notebook, copying recipes and sketching processes with curious hands. He noticed inconsistencies in provenance statements and patterns in who vanished without search. When he asked small questions, he was soothed with family fables. When his questions sharpened, he met thin admonitions and implied debts. The Whitmores tested loyalty like a grower testing soil. Favors, stories, and small intimacies bound apprentices to silence. Comfortable lives were the reward for those who complied. Others found they had less time to ask why. As political turmoil gathered beyond county lines, the Philadelphia yearly meeting appointed Elijah Thompson, a methodical Quaker with a legal background, to inquire into irregular practices in outlying parishes. He believed in procedure, in records, and he would not be comforted by gifts or evasions. When Elijah Thompson arrived, he carried a different kind of hunger, not for profit, but for records. He was a man who had once practiced law, and then chosen the society of friends. His temper was methodical, his gaze trained to see what shadows cast from ordinary shapes. Thompson's first visits were procedural questions about donations, inventories of ornaments, and lists of names who had received curious parcels. He asked for receipts. He asked for shipping manifests. He asked whether anyone had ever inquired further. The Whitmores received him with the same decorum their craft afforded. Nathaniel presented testimonials, well-mannered clients vouched for his integrity, and Elizabeth served tea while she arranged flowers as if daily life had not been touched by darker commerce. Mary and Sarah produced ledgers that appeared neat and above board. Thompson, patient and precise, took the papers and read them like a geologist reads strata, searching for layers out of place. In the meantime, small anomalies accumulated: a ledger page torn and replaced, a letter with a smudged postmark, a parish record that omitted an inquiry into a missing child. Thompson noted patterns others overlook: a cluster of benefactions following each disappearance, and surprising absences in routine inquiries that should have been made. He began to interview parishioners who had received relics, asking how the object came to them, and requesting any private communications about its provenance. The Whitmores attempted to manage the inquiry through familiar means: private persuasion, discreet gifts, and invoking the sanctity of faith to halt curiosity. They suggested charity might hurt the community if details were aired. That rumor could erode trust. Some ministers, invested in the fruits of their relics, urged caution. Others, uncomfortable, evaded his questions. Thompson requested permission to view the Whitmore workshop and to inspect their storerooms. The request stirred the family like wind blowing a dust-layered curtain. Nathaniel hesitated. Elizabeth's face settled into practiced calm. The family convened in whisper. They had avoided this scrutiny so far, and they had ways to dissuade a man of law. Thompson was not easily sent away. They considered threats and bribes, old alliances, and the possibility of moving operations. Above all, they feared one thing their wealth could not buy: a man unwilling to close his notebook now. Thompson's request to inspect the workshop was a breach the Whitmores had always feared. They agreed to a limited viewing, a show that would satisfy decorum while protecting the private rooms below. Nathaniel walked the inspector through a corridor of polished altar fronts, opening doors to storerooms of fine wood and brass where he pulled aside curtains to reveal trays of labeled fragments and delicate boxes. He spoke of provenance and reverence and handed Thompson an elegantly carved reliquary. Thompson held the object with the careful neutrality of a man who measures evidence for a living. He asked for documentation and was offered soft excuses: a missing merchant's ledger, a lost letter, a disturbance in the courier system. When he stepped toward the cellar door, Mary Whitmore produced an invoice and Elizabeth invited him to sit and write in the parlor. The family meant for delay to become dissuasion. They trusted procedure could be used to outweigh investigation. Daniel Foster watched from the threshold, a carpenter's apprentice with more curiosity than caution. He had been given small privileges and had observed more than the family believed. He had seen how certain names were circled in Elizabeth's ledger and how Nathaniel's hands lingered on some packages longer than others. When Thompson's gaze moved to the workshop's lower door, Daniel felt the pull of two loyalties: the warmth of apprenticeship and a rising shame that made his hands tremble. Outside, the town maintained its rhythms. Parishioners came to receive communion, and ministers preached of providence. Inside the Whitmore house, a different liturgy was performed: polite tea, measured testimony, and the careful wrapping of relics sent to distant churches. The family used that ritual to sanctify itself, to make questions sacrilege. Yet Thompson's notebook grew heavier with notes: a mismatched label here, a ledger stitched over, a letter referencing a shipment with no recorded sender. That evening, as the inspector left beneath a sky freckled with stars, Nathaniel and Elizabeth argued in hushed voices about the next move. Mary sorted bundles by candlelight. Daniel sat in the corner with his private notebook and copied a phrase he had heard from Thompson: record is a kind of truth. He wrote it twice, underlining each word until the meaning settled on his page like a verdict. The family had always believed they could choose which facts the world should remember, but now doubt. The family's composure frayed as Thompson's inquiries tightened. He returned with a small committee and formal questions that could not be deflected by tea or tidy ledgers. Nathaniel attempted the familiar moves: plausible letters, a few strategic gifts, a patient sermon about the danger of scandal. But Thompson's methodical patience produced evidence in the spaces the Whitmores had assumed were private. He pointed to discrepancies and asked for follow-up on missing parishioners whose names had been hushed. Daniel's private notebook grew into a problem he could no longer ignore. He had copied receipts that did not match shipments, and he had sketched the sub-basement plans that no apprentice should have seen. At night he sat alone and read the names he had transcribed. Each name was a silence he had touched with his own hands. The warmth of belonging curdled into shame. He watched Elizabeth move through the parlor with the same serene face that had once comforted him, and he realized she had been constructing narratives to sell. Something shifted then. The Whitmores accelerated their operations, believing that speed could bury scrutiny. They arranged more shipments, sent more ornate casings further afield, and tightened the circle of those privy to their methods. They launched a campaign of subtle discredit against Thompson, rumors about his motives, hints at political bias. Yet for all their careful measures, an idea had taken root inside Daniel that could not be pruned by payment or intimidation. If you have reached this moment and feel your attention folding inward, perform the ritual now. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to mark that you carry this knowledge. Say it slowly. Let the words settle. Let them make you complicit or awake. Either way, the shape of the tale alters with your admission. On a late winter morning, a child at a church-run asylum vanished. The caretakers searched and found nothing. The Whitmores attended the memorial, presenting a small reliquary with a solemn note. Attendance rose, offerings swelled. In rooms far from Chester County, hands clasped the object and prayed. The pattern continued, and the net around the Whitmores seemed to tighten like a noose and a blanket at once. Daniel resolved to record everything and to find a witness who would believe. Daniel could not carry his ledger forever. One rainy evening he sealed several pages in an envelope with his own hand and walked to the meeting house where Elijah Thompson sometimes stayed for prayer. His hands trembled as he placed the envelope on a bench and then left a coin beneath a tile as a signal. He needed a witness who would keep record, and he needed someone with the patience to follow paper trails. He feared both retribution and the quiet annihilation of truth that happened when people preferred comfortable narratives. Thompson found the envelope after a week and read the cramped notes with a slow, accumulating anger. Daniel had included delivery dates, names, and oddities, tampered letters, shipments with no senders, and the notation of places where small memorial boxes had been placed in parishes. The physician's earlier vanishings were echoed in the ledger. Reading it, Thompson felt the map of patterns become a route between the Whitmore home and distant chapels. He wrote questions and began to plan a stricter inquiry. When Thompson confronted Daniel privately, the apprentice confessed more than he had written. He told of cellar doors and recipes, of a system that processed absence into demand. He spoke of Elizabeth's discernment, of Nathaniel's patient calculations, and of the family's habit of turning grief into product. Daniel's voice shook, but his detail was precise. He offered to show Thompson certain places if Thompson would promise safety and a witness able to carry his testimony beyond local interest. The arrangement was delicate. Thompson brought 2 elders to the meeting house and listened as Daniel described the family's methods. The elders moved like men who feared rocking the community's piety. Yet one elder, moved by the notion of truth, agreed to accompany Thompson to a discreet inspection. They could not arrest anyone on the spot. They needed records, witnesses, and a chain of custody that would survive money and persuasion. That night Daniel returned home with a weight that felt like relief and terror in equal measure. He had stepped into the open without knowing if the world would accept his story. The Whitmores, sensing a threat, began to act with a clinical sort of speed. They promised favors, hinted at ruin, and whispered that a false accusation could destroy a man's soul. Daniel, whose ledger had once been an apprentice's curiosity, now carried the shape of indictment and fragile courage. Thompson, armed with Daniel's ledger and the elders' cautious approval, began a formal inquiry. They collected records from parishes, lined up dates, and recorded testimonies from parishioners who had received relics. Some accounts were moved by gratitude, others were thin and circular. The committee worked like a cartographer tracing a boundary. They marked anomalies, connected disappearances to shipments, and sought a legal principle that could hold a family accountable across jurisdictions. The Whitmores responded with the tools of their trade. They provided more testimonies, manufactured additional histories of provenance, and leaned on allies to question Thompson's motive. They pointed to Daniel's youth and obscurity. They whispered that a disgruntled apprentice might seek revenge for imagined slights. Their patrons wrote to the conveners, urging the preservation of parish peace. Nathaniel spoke of piety betrayed by rumor and asked that decorum be preserved while accusations were examined. Still, as more records were compared, contradictions multiplied. The committee found a cluster of missing persons whose disappearances coincided with packages delivered to churches reporting miracles, and those packages often traced back to the Whitmore workshop. The elders, some reluctant, began to press for fuller disclosures and to request access to hidden storerooms. Ministers who had benefited feared scandal, but the law's appetite for clarity fed the elders' resolve. When formal letters were sent seeking documentation, the Whitmores had to choose their next move. Under pressure, the Whitmores acted in 2 directions. They attempted to bind the investigators with social pressure, and they tried to control the narrative by offering larger gifts to favored churches. Nathaniel made a show of penitence in private, but privately he sought to arrange transfers of property and to place essential documents where they might be lost to fire or plague, should the need arise. The family's movements became furtive, and now there were more hands involved in their concealment, which only tightened suspicion. Soon the inquiry would become a public hearing beyond the family's control and beyond simple repair now. The hearing opened in a room thick with expectation. Elders, ministers, tradesmen, and townsfolk gathered to hear testimony that could not be softly returned to private prayer. Thompson presented a paper, dates, shipments, and the ledger Daniel had risked his life to hide. Witnesses spoke in measured voices, some in defense, many in distress. Parishioners told of sudden cures and of how their ministers had counseled them to pray before an object of unquestioned origin. Others remembered an awkward secrecy around provenance. Nathaniel Whitmore attended and sat as if within a carved chair whose grain hid his hands. He answered with practiced calm and produced letters and receipts that his daughters had drafted to a fault. Elizabeth's bearing was immaculate, Mary and Sarah read statements claiming good faith and honorable trade. Their allies in the clergy offered testimonies that spoke more of the spiritual good achieved than the details of provenance. But Thompson and the committee read the ledger alongside those letters and saw a different coherence. Under oath, witnesses who had once praised the relics recounted other details. Parcels arriving with vague provenance, ministers asked to keep matters private, and gifts that coincided with the appearance of miracles. The committee compared dates until patterns resolved into a chain. Questions of morality became questions of responsibility. The hearing demanded not only intent, but a record that could survive argument. The Whitmores, sensing the slow collapse, tried last measures of influence. They proposed binding agreements, offered larger donations, and warned of scandal. Nathaniel suggested that a public airing would do harm to the congregation and to faith itself. For some in the room, that plea had power. For others, the ledger and the testimonies were a heavier thing. The hearing extended into long evenings, and the town watched as the family's reputation thinned. The town braced as rumor and law met in public reckoning. Following the hearing, the committee moved the matter from church discipline towards civic consequence. Magistrates examined the ledger and the testimonies and authorized inquiries that crossed county lines. Arrests were suggested for those who had obstructed investigations. Warrants were drafted. The Whitmores had counted on social capital to protect them, but the pattern of records the committee presented was hard to ignore. Nathaniel tried to bargain. Pledges of increased parish gifts, offers of private arbitration to avoid scandal. Some clergy urged restraint, others insisted law proceed. Lawyers demanded clear chains of custody and witnesses willing to swear to dates and shipments. Daniel's ledger became the backbone of the case. Entries, names, and notes about delayed inquiries that now read like a map of culpability. The first seizures were methodical. Officials inventoried boxes, removed objects for safekeeping, and secured property. Nathaniel watched as constables read names and packed ornate cases into crates. Elizabeth maintained a composed face while Mary and Sarah answered questions about ledgers and letters. To many townsfolk it appeared as an uncomfortable restoration of order. To the Whitmores it felt like the slow unmaking of a life built on curated silence. Pressure extended outward. Ministers who had cherished their relics faced parishioners' doubt. Some denied knowing the provenance, others admitted a private trust that had prevented scrutiny. Patrons who once boasted of miracles found their standing diminished. Daniel, oddly liberated and terrified, submitted to depositions and repeated what he had written with a clarity born of fear and conscience. One elder, long complicit, broke under scrutiny and provided names of collaborators. A tradesman confessed to facilitating shipments, naming routes and men paid to carry boxes at night. Communities were forced into re-evaluation. Some congregations held emergency meetings to return relics. The Whitmores' reputation unraveled into shreds of accusation and denial. Where once they had been patron and benefactor, now they stood isolated, and neighbors whispered about property transfers and law moved. The unraveling became public spectacle as confessions multiplied. One churchman named men who had once joked about miracles. A tradesman identified nocturnal routes used to move packages. Those who had profited found their names recorded in depositions. The court of public opinion pressed alongside official proceedings, and the Whitmores felt both legal weight and social collapse. Nathaniel tried to preserve his estate transferals, hurried sales, and the concealment of correspondence in trusted trunks. Elizabeth, small and composed, calculated each move in silence. Mary and Sarah, the sisters who managed accounts and letters, fractured under pressure. One claimed ignorance while the other insisted on the family's pious intentions. Their private disputes leaked into public testimony and served the investigators. Indictments were filed on counts ranging from obstruction to falsifying records and conspiracy to mislead ecclesiastical authorities. The arraignment set a trial in motion that required witnesses to stand against money and threat. Some tradesmen produced evidence of ordered deliveries. Parishioners testified about sudden offerings, and a few ministers, chastened, admitted that they had been asked to keep certain matters private. Daniel's ledger became the prosecution's spine. Pages were displayed under solemn light as he testified with a clarity that shocked those who had once called him apprentice. He recited dates, routes, and irregularities. He described how certain parcels always coincided with miraculous claims. In doing so, he exchanged belonging for truth, and his testimony rewired the town's sense of who had been complicit. Former apprentices, now freed from obligation, spoke of rooms they had been forbidden to enter. Clients who had once praised relics now provided anecdotal details that contradicted the family's public narrative. Each deposition tightened the chain of evidence. The Whitmores' counsel argued mistakes and good faith, but the ledger's consistency and the number of corroborating witnesses made a sustained defense difficult. In the final days of the hearings, pressure produced more than testimony. It produced confession, some whispered, some written and sealed. A senior servant left a folded note in a desk. A family friend offered a statement of remorse. Even Nathaniel's face, composed, showed cracks. When the verdicts came, they were a mixture of law and moral judgment. Some Whitmore associates received reprimands, others faced fines and the loss of positions. Nathaniel himself was found culpable of conspiracy and obstruction. He received a sentence that included imprisonment and the forfeiture of certain estates. Elizabeth, whose role the court treated with complicity rather than direct malice, was declared an accessory in the sense of the law and was ordered to make public restitution. Public reaction was a slow but relentless process. Congregations returned relics and held emergency meetings to account for past credence. Some ministers resigned, others pleaded for forgiveness. Patrons whose families had benefited apologized in printed statements. The town's social bonds reknit themselves more cautiously, but legal penalties could not entirely repair the moral rupture that had allowed such exploitation to flourish. Nathaniel's imprisonment was not dramatic. It was administrative and bureaucratic, the sort of restraint that suggested a society attempting to correct rather than to destroy. In custody, he was removed from the workshop and from the rituals that had defined his life. The family home, once full of the comfortable noises of industry, quieted into echo. Elizabeth, tending accounts and arranging affairs, worked to preserve what she could for the children and kin who had not been implicated. Meanwhile, Daniel, though spared criminal charge because of his cooperation, lived with a weight that never lifted. He answered questions, provided context, and watched as the ledger he had risked his safety to compile became exhibit and evidence. The tradesmen who testified faced social fallout, and a few fled to avoid retribution. Yet others stayed, offering depositions that strengthened the case and revealed networks that extended beyond the Whitmore name. But interior consequences lingered: children raised in shame, apprentices left without craft, and churches forever cautious about what relics they welcomed from then. The Whitmore name receded into hushed references and historical footnotes, but the echoes of their enterprise persisted in chapels and in memory. Relics that had been worshipped were returned, catalogued, or in some cases quietly disposed of. Some churches publicly removed the objects from display, others reframed them as items of historical curiosity. The market for such sanctified curiosities dimmed, not because faith vanished, but because institutions learned that secrecy could be weaponized. Over time, fragments of the story surfaced in unexpected places. A letter slipped between pages in a parish book, a receipt found folded in a donated trunk, a folded confession wrapped into a wall during a prison cell's renovation. These scraps made a mosaic of culpability and remorse. One such discovery, years after the trial, revealed a confession written by a family member whose name had been lost to shame. The document was brief, tremulous, and precise. An accounting of choices, a mea culpa that asked for nothing but record. Communities that had once eagerly accepted miracles now debated how to remember and how to teach. Some elders used the episode as a case study in vigilance. Do not let hunger for wonder outpace duty to truth. In the private sphere, families carried shards of the Whitmore story as cautionary tales, passed down like warnings about how institutions can be corrupted when desire for influence overrides compassion. Daniel lived the rest of his life in the town, but not entirely in peace. His apprenticeship did not resume with the same ease. Distrust lingered, and the mark of being a witness never fully faded. Yet he found redemption in small ways, helping a widow reclaim a parcel, advising ministers on provenance, and keeping a careful public ledger to assure others a record could hold truth safe. He married, had children, and taught them the discipline of noting dates and names, insisting that memory must be documented. The Whitmore enterprise had been built on an ugly principle that holiness could be manufactured and sold. The downfall proved that even well-crafted lies are vulnerable to the patient insistence of record and witness. But the story also taught something harsher, that institutions can enable horrors by preferring reputation to inquiry. That lesson outlasted any single family and became part of the town's long, uneasy inheritance. It remains a warning: examine wonder closely, never let silence become habit. Years later, if you walk through certain meeting houses in the counties touched by this story, you will find small wooden boxes tucked into dark corners or stored in locked cabinets. They are often labeled with careful script and a date range that hints at origins. Parishioners may tell you that these objects were reclaimed, that they now serve as reminders of the fragility of faith when it is monetized. Ask gently, and someone may lower their voice and tell you about a family that carved holiness to order and later lost it. What endures is not only the physical residue but a social lesson about the hunger that shapes institutions. The Whitmores exploited desire for cure, for certainty, for the smoothing of fear, and in doing so they revealed how easily community trust can be compressed into a commodity. Their downfall showed that meticulous record-keeping and courageous testimony could dismantle a carefully constructed illusion. It was not swift spectacle, but procedural, patient, and anchored in the persistence of witnesses. There is a darker residue to the knowledge that people will still look for signs and buy assurances, and that sometimes authority prefers tidy narratives to inconvenient inquiry. Even with the Whitmores disgraced, the mechanisms they used, secrecy, selective compassion, and the monetization of sanctity, did not vanish overnight. Institutions, by inertia and kindness, can again become porous to those who would exploit them. That is why record, testimony, and the courage to speak remain essential civic practices. So, what does it mean for you who has sat with this tale? It means that stories like this are not curiosities to be consumed and then shelved. They are warnings about how ordinary life can be inverted into something sinister when desire meets opportunity. It means that when you encounter claims that feel too tidy, you might ask for names and dates. It means that when institutions whisper that silence preserves faith, you should instead listen for the voice of record. Keep that mirror near. Let it sharpen your sense of what truth asks of us. If you keep one thing from this story, keep the practice, hold records, honor witnesses, and press where inquiry is missing until truth is remembered.